Proposition 53.
So Proposition 53 requires statewide voter approval before the state can issue revenue bonds over $2 billion for a single project if that project is owned, operated, maintained, or financed by the state. So just to step back a little bit, the state funds its infrastructure in a couple of different ways. Sometimes the state just spends cash. It just spends the dollars that it has in its bank account right now, basically, on infrastructure. But other times the state borrows money. And the main way that the state borrows money is through the issuance of bonds. You've already heard a little bit about bonds from my colleague here. That's one kind of bonds, general obligation bonds. So general obligation bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the state, and typically the state repays these bonds using its general fund, which is basically its sort of main operating account, the account it uses to pay for all kinds of state services. But sometimes the state issues another type of bond, and this type of bond is called a revenue bond. And the way revenue bonds generally work is they're repaid not from the state's general fund, but from the revenue stream generated by a project. So kind of the classic example of a revenue bond is you could issue one to build a bridge. And if you issued a revenue bond to build a bridge, you'd repay that revenue bond using the tolls that users of the bridge pay every time they cross. So historically, and actually in current law, there's a voter approval requirement for general obligation bonds, which is why voters are being asked to vote on the school bond this year. But there isn't a voter requirement for revenue bonds. So this would just change that, and basically it would require a voter approval for basically certain very large revenue bonds issued by the state. So in terms of the fiscal effect, we noted that the fiscal effect is really uncertain in this instance. And one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the fiscal effect of this measure is that $2 billion is a very high threshold. We don't think that there are very many projects that will be covered by this measure, probably a relatively small number. And so a lot's going to depend on the specifics of those projects, what happens. It's possible that those projects could move forward even with this measure. So it's possible that voters, even if those projects qualify under this measure, voters might approve them, they might move forward anyway. In that case, there would be very little fiscal effect on the state. Of course, it's also possible that those projects might not move forward as originally planned. Either they might use another type of financing, so instead of revenue bonds, they could use general obligation bonds or cash or something else, and that could have either positive or negative fiscal effects on the state. Or it's possible that the state might not move forward with those projects at all. For example, the state could pursue various smaller individual projects rather than a big $2 billion project. So once again, that could have various fiscal effects on the state. So overall, it's uncertain what the net effect might be.
All right, we have in support the California Republican Party and the Libertarian Party of California are in support. And then opposition, we have the Democratic Party, Peace and Freedom, and then other Democratic organizations. In support, we have 22 different taxpayer associations, and in opposition, there are 9 environmental organizations, other community organizations, government organizations, public safety, healthcare, infrastructure, taxpayer, water districts, businesses, and unions. We have the governor is against, and we have a representative who's in support. And then opposition is stronger for newspapers. And the spending here is $4.5 million in favor and about $2.25 against. The in favor is almost always all from the same married couple. He is a retired farmer and food company executive who has been sort of against state government spending in the past on other issues. And then against, we have mostly unions who are against that for obvious reasons. Questions?
Is this connected to the rail project?
So it's possible that the rail project could be covered by this. The rail project is certainly over $2 billion. It's one of the few state projects that clearly is over $2 billion. However, it's not entirely certain whether that project would use revenue bonds. If it did use revenue bonds, then it would be covered by this, but it could pursue a different financing approach.
Now, when exactly does this qualify for the ballot? Is it upon initial assessment that it's going to be over 2 billion, or as the project's ongoing?
So before the bonds could be issued, they would have to receive voter approval. So basically, the State Department that's in charge of the project would have to make a determination about whether they thought the project would be covered, and then if they thought that it would be covered by this, they would have to seek voter approval. I think it's also worth noting that typically, before you issue bonds, you need basically attorneys to weigh in and say that those bonds are going to be valid. And so that's something that would probably have to happen as well. Basically, the bonds counsel, the attorneys for the bonds would say, well, we think that this project wouldn't be covered, and so we think it's okay to go ahead and issue those bonds without voter approval. Or they might say, look, we think that it could be covered by this measure, so you do need to go seek voter approval.
Great, thank you.